The whole of nature had looked to people in the 18th century as though it had been designed by someone, like the great landscape gardens then so much in vogue. In the way each creature was perfectly adapted to its place in the whole stable, harmonious scheme of things, they saw evidence of the power and wisdom of God. This was the argument from design. When scientists began to look at nature historically, the challenge was to produce a better explanation of how living things have come to be so perfectly adapted to their ways of life and to each other. It was, of course, Charles Darwin who found the new explanation. By the time he returned from the Beagle voyage in 1836, the new understanding of adaptation was already taking shape in his mind. Darwin settled in London for a few years, writing, making notes, walking in places like the newly opened London Zoo.
In July, opened my first notebook on the transmutation of species. Had been greatly struck from about March by character of species of Galapagos archipelago. If we choose to let conjecture run wild, then animals may partake from our origin. In one common ancestor, we may all be netted together.
An extraordinary thought, but it went right against the standard idea of the fixity of species. Was there any evidence that species could change? Well, there was one, right under people's noses. All our domestic dogs have one common ancestor, apparently the wolf. Merely by selecting from the variety to be found in litters of pups, human breeders, in only a few thousand years, have created all the bizarre variety of our modern breeds of dog.
Opponents will say, show me the intermediate forms. I will answer yes, if you will show me every step between bulldog and greyhound.
But how could selection occur in nature?
In October 1838, I happened to read Malthus, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on, from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work.
But it was to be another 20 years before the theory was sufficiently worked out to give to the world. In 1842, Darwin brought his family to settle here at Down House in Kent, and he began his careful, methodical routine. Darwin wrote a sketch of his theory in 1842, a short book in 1844, and a very long book from 1854. Finally, in 1859, the fourth version came out as On the Origin of Species. After 20 years' gestation, the book had become one long, carefully constructed argument which anticipates every objection the reader can think of. And The Origin of Species is in no way a deliberately provocative book. Darwin doesn't even discuss human evolution beyond saying discreetly that light will be thrown on the origin of man. And he makes the important point that psychology will become evolutionary in the future. He speaks of God as creator of the whole system of nature and the first living things. He doesn't mention his darker thoughts about the cruelty of nature. On the whole, the tone of the book is optimistic. It has still something of the flavour of the old theological science of the parson naturalists of the past. Many leading scientists and some liberal clergymen were quick to accept its arguments. Darwin did have allies, but neither he nor they could do anything to avert the fury that broke over his head.
Considering how fiercely I have been attacked by the orthodox, it seems ludicrous that I was intended to be a clergyman. At that time, I did not in the least doubt the strict and literal truth of every word in the Bible. Whilst aboard the Beagle, I was quite orthodox. But I gradually came to see that the Old Testament was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus, or the beliefs of any barbarian, with its manifestly false history of the world, with the Tower of Babel and all the rest. By such reflections as these, I gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation.
So Darwin lost his belief in the literal truth of the Bible quite early in life. And he never seems to have considered the possibility of a liberal or critical view of the Bible. But that was not the end of his religion, because in his day people believed that the existence of God, his design and creation of the world, and the immortality of the human soul could be established purely by reason, independent of any scriptures or religious authority, but simply by arguing from the facts of nature. It was called natural theology, and it mattered a lot to Darwin. He didn't give it up easily. But Darwin was English with a certain literalness of mind. He always treated design and special creation by God as if it were a rival scientific explanation, an opponent of his own theory. The only sort of God Darwin could really understand was a scientific hypothesis God, postulated to account for the order in the world. As that sort of God faded out of science in Darwin's lifetime, so he faded out of Darwin's mind.
The old argument from design in nature fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by men. There seems to be no more design in the action of natural selection than in the course the wind blows. Yet there remains the impossibility of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man, as the result of blind chance or necessity. When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look for a first cause having an intelligent mind. This conclusion was strong in my mind about the time I wrote The Origin of Species, and it is only since that time that it has very gradually, with many fluctuations, become weaker. But then arises the doubt. Can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animals, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? I cannot pretend to throw the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic.
Many people followed this darker and more agnostic side of Darwin's thought. The world process was amoral, and man was locked into it. No room remained for the ideas of a benevolent providence and life after death. However, when pressed, Darwin himself allowed that evolution might be compatible with faith in a creator. God had perhaps chosen this strange way of bringing us into being. So liberal Christians saw Darwin as teaching that the law of life is progress through struggle and suffering. Yet, for pessimists and optimists alike, Darwin marked a major shift in our view of life. Perhaps the profoundest shift of all is the passing away of the old belief that our true home lies somewhere else than on this earth. We're not, it seems, immortal souls who only temporarily happen to be housed in these bodies. Rather, we are products of nature, embedded in nature. We're of the earth, to the earth we return. So the old kind of ascetical religion that punished and repressed human nature for the sake of a better life somewhere else now seems futile, and indeed Christians are already giving it up to a remarkable extent. Religion returns to this earth. That perhaps is the profoundest impact of Darwin's revolution.